Hi everybody, on a frosty day in New Hampshire, Professor Kauser here. I want to give you another brief video lecture on some themes relating to the readings this week for the World History class. Particularly today thinking about royal absolutism in Europe in the 16th, 17th, and getting into the 18th centuries. I think the textbook does a pretty good job covering this. What I want to do though is point out a couple of things to put it in a bit of context so we can understand better what's going on over the longer term, particularly the medieval background to the rise of absolutism. Before 1500, in the Middle Ages, there were a number of limitations on a king's power. Everybody agreed that kings were in charge of their kingdoms, that they were the highest political authority. You didn't have democracy or anything like that, although you had a few institutions of communication between kings and their subjects, like the English Parliament and some others, which moved in that kind of a direction. But at the same time, there were also some pretty significant limitations on a king's power. One of them is something I talked about in the prior video lecture, which was the power of the nobility. The king got the resources to rule from being a major landowner with lots of revenues and lots of people living on royal lands, that is to say actual land owned by the king within his kingdom, and that drew a lot of power to kings. The king also had the right to make laws and to establish courts that would enforce the laws, and that was a major avenue of royal power. But at the same time, kings ruled kingdoms in medieval Europe that had lots of nobles, and those nobles were themselves landowners, with lots of lands, lots of revenues, lots of wealth of their own. They had lots of people who were under their authority that they could call on to support them or to fight for them. And they had a lot of legal power within their lordships as well. There was something called feudal law, which gave lords rights over certain kinds of situations within their manors and villages, and baronies and duchies and counties and so forth. They could raise forces of their own. They had certain rights they could hold out over against the kings. So the power of the nobles was a really major check on the power of medieval kings. The other dimension of limitation on medieval kings' powers was the power of religion. We talked about this beforehand, talking about how influential religion was in pre-modern societies, and we talked about bishops and popes. The church was a very major kind of a factor. For one thing, the church itself was a major landowner with all the wealth and power and influence that came from that. And also, within the religious framework, the moral framework and therefore also the ideological framework that people used to justify power also involved religion. The very common formula you would see in a lot of kingdoms on royal documents is someone would announce himself as so-and-so, Charles, king by the grace of God. This is a formula that goes all the way back to Charlemagne in the 8th and 9th centuries AD. King by the grace of God. And that idea of grace in Christian theology is the idea of God giving favor to somebody who may or may not actually deserve it. Okay, so sort of by the mercy of God, by the favor of God, a certain person was able to be king. And that implied that the king had certain responsibilities, right? They didn't have their kingship on their own, by their own rights. They had it because God had chosen to bestow it upon them, and that implied in return that the king had responsibilities to God to govern his kingdom in a just way, and to see to it that the church was protected, that Christianity was supported. All these kinds of things. All this was woven into medieval ideology. That could be a limitation on the king's power because the church carried the role of being the mouthpiece of God in the kingdom, and therefore if the king wanted to maintain ideological legitimacy, if he wanted to be seen as a proper and just king ruling as he ought to, he really needed the support of the church in order to do that, which meant that the church was in a position where it could potentially criticize kings, could guide kings, could advise kings. If a king was misbehaving or contradicting the way the church thought the king ought to be ruling, the church could go so far as to denounce the king, perhaps even excommunicate the king, which would mean kicking him out of church and saying effectively that he's going to hell. Not very good for the king's ability to represent himself as a just and proper legitimate ruler. So the church had a lot of influence over how kings ruled and over the king's ability to justify their rule in the way they were operating. Okay, so the medieval kings are very powerful, of course, but between the nobility and the church, there were a lot of limitations on royal power. Okay, this brings us into the early modern period after 1500 and the growth of absolutism. Medieval kingship was not absolute, it was limited. The idea of absolute monarchy, or absolutism we're looking at in this chapter, is the idea that the king is accountable to no human being, but is only accountable to God himself. Right? Nobody can judge the king, nobody can challenge the king or contradict the king. The king is the sole legitimate source of authority, and the king responds directly to God. There are a couple of things going on in the early modern period which make absolutism possible, both of which we've foreshadowed in previous lectures. One of them is the problems that the nobility start having, right? Owing to things like gunpowder, owing to things like the rising prosperity of the merchant classes, middle classes, merchants and bankers and craftsmen in their towns, they're starting to, thanks to the growth of trade and finance, they're starting to have a lot more wealth to throw around, and therefore a lot more ability to exercise political influence of their own, to raise militias and troops of their own, and all of this kind of sets the nobles over against the merchants and the townsmen, and the nobles are kind of getting squeezed from below by the middle class, these commoners who are becoming more and more wealthy and powerful. That's one challenge going on, and gunpowder, of course, like we talked about, makes castles obsolete, makes knights in shining armor obsolete. You no longer have a class-based military advantage of the nobles over the lower classes, which are going to enable them to continue dominating society. That's a bit of a crisis for the nobles. They're not stupid. They can see what's going on. They start thinking about how can they go about securing their status and their power and wealth in society. And what it means is that instead of resisting kings or limiting kings' authority the way that they used to do, nobles are more and more willing to cooperate with kings, to align themselves with kings, and the kings, in order to get what they want done, are going to sort of accept the nobles and will support noble interests over against the commoners in many cases. Not, it's not all black and white. There's lots of sort of shades of gray and different ways that different people proceed here, but basically the nobles are getting more and more into the king's pocket. Okay, less and less acting as an independent force that's going to limit king's authority as you're going through the early modern period. So that's one side. The other side is the religious side. The Protestant Reformation really changes the relationship between church and state. The medieval church, being a kind of a universal institution with no serious rivals, a few fragmentary groups they could condemn as heretics and persecute, but didn't really have any serious rivals for religious influence, and therefore the medieval church had a certain kind of independent standing that it could often use to, as I said, criticize kings, challenge kings, limit kings' power, guide kings' behavior, so that kings ruled in a way that was considered religiously legitimate. The Reformation affects that because now, instead of there being a more or less unified front of the church, there never really had been a completely unified front, but still, instead of having a kind of independent church, now you've got the church fragmented into different kinds of churches, various Protestant churches, Catholic churches, competing with one another, and in the struggles between Protestantism and Catholicism, it's going to be the secular authorities who are really going to make the decision which kind of a church are we going to have in our kingdom, or in our city, or in our county or duchy, or whatever the relevant political unit is. Right? So all of a sudden, they'd always kind of been significant as patrons and protectors of churches, but now secular rulers and governments are going to become much more important and much more, they're going to have more leverage and power in religious matters because they're the ones who get to decide, are we going to protect traditional Catholicism in our kingdom here and try and get rid of Protestantism, or are we going to reform our churches and kick the Pope out and kick the Catholics out, the priests and monks out, and go over to a Protestant-style church? That becomes a king's decision to make politically, and what it's going to mean is that the church, whether it's Protestant or Catholic, is going to be much less capable than it used to be of challenging, limiting royal authority. Right? The church is going to be much less willing to put itself in the role of being a critic of the church. Being a critic of the king. Why? Because if you criticize the king too much and tell him he can't do what he wants to do, then the king is going to kick your church out and bring the other church in. Right? He's going to kick the Pope out, bring the Protestants in. Kick the Protestants out, bring the Catholics back. And you actually see this happening. England is the classic case of a flip-flopping kingdom. England goes back and forth more than anybody else. It starts off with King Henry VIII in the 1520s. When Protestantism first comes along, Henry actually publishes a book in his name. Probably didn't really write it himself, but sort of has it, ghostwritten for him and published under his name, sort of attacking Protestantism and defending the faith, and the Pope is all thrilled with Henry because Henry's a great defender of Catholicism against this Protestant heresy. Well, then Henry wants to get a divorce, and his wife that he wants to get divorced from happens to be a daughter of the King of Spain, who is very, very close to the Pope. The Pope refuses to grant a dispensation to allow this divorce because he doesn't want to alienate the Spanish. And so what Henry does is does a complete 180-degree turn and declares himself to be the head of the English Church, eliminates Catholicism, and England becomes Protestant. Problem is that Henry doesn't have a lot of children. He only has one male child who survives. And Edward VI, who goes even sort of further in his sort of teenage years as king with developing Protestantism in England, but he dies young. His half-sister Mary comes in, who is married to the very Catholic House of Guise in France, and so she brings Catholicism back, starts persecuting Protestants, burns about 300 of them at the stake. All of a sudden England is a Catholic country again under Mary. But Mary also doesn't live very long, only about 4 years, and when she dies, her half-sister Elizabeth comes to the throne. Elizabeth decides to go back to Protestantism, but in a more sort of moderate, compromise kind of a version, more like what Henry had originally planned on. So he's kind of flip-flopping Catholic, Protestant, going on, and all this, what this means is that the churchmen in England are not going to be doing a whole lot to criticize or challenge or limit the king's power, or the queen's power, as the case may be, right? They want to be on the monarch's good side in order to enable their version of Christianity to prevail in the kingdom. And similar things are going on, not as much flip-flopping, but the similar kinds of concerns are going on in a lot of other places in Europe. So what this means is that as you're getting through the 16th century and into the 17th century, the church is no longer limiting royal power the way that it used to do. And this sets up one of the major ways that people argue for royal absolutism. You go from having kings by the grace of God, kind of dependent on the mercy of God, and therefore dependent on the support of the church, to kings saying they are kings by divine right. See, that's a stronger way of putting it. You're not king by the grace of God, you're king by right, by divine right. God has ordained that you shall be king. And that's a more stronger way of saying that you're not going to take criticism from anybody, not even the church. Right? The king gets his power not through the church or not in a way that's dependent on the church, but the king gets his power directly from God, and therefore the king is not going to answer to anybody but God himself for the king's actions. Right? So that sort of gets at the version of absolutism. There's a couple of other directions absolutism comes from, by the way, a couple of other arguments with the supreme power of the king that are not religious. One of them is a sort of a property argument where it argues that because the king inherits the kingdom, therefore the kingdom itself is a kind of property. Right? Normally, just as in a modern country, there's a distinction between royal property, the actual land that the king owns, versus the territory of the kingdom that he rules, right, which may be owned by nobles or landowners or, anybody else, the same as any other thing. You look at America, there is property, which is, property of the federal government, and then there's, land which belongs to various American people. The government has legal sovereignty over it but doesn't own it. Well, they sort of blur that distinction in a sense, right, under absolutism. One of the arguments is because the king inherits the kingdom, the same way a person inherits real estate, in a sense the king is the ultimate owner of the entire kingdom, right? The kingdom is his personal property, and therefore just as a person can do what they want with their land or their house or whatever, So also the king can do as he pleases with the kingdom, and nobody can tell him he can't. Okay, so sort of a property argument alongside of the religious argument. Another dimension is kind of a legal argument. It goes back to Roman law, which is still being used as a source of law in Europe at this time. And in Roman law, the patriarch of the family, the pater familias, sort of father of the family, has a very, very strong role. Romans really gave a very powerful role to fathers in their kingdom, which sort of gave them absolute authority over all the other members of their family, not only their children, but their wives, and so forth as well. So the other thing that they will do is say, well, the king is the father of the kingdom, and therefore, just as in Roman law, a father has absolute authority over his wife and children, so also the king has absolute legal authority over his subjects, because they're a kind of children to him legally. So there's another argument that gets made in favor of this absolute style of rule. Okay. So far, the sort of on the theory of absolutism. The other thing to bear in mind when we look at absolutism in Europe is that all of this is political theory. All of this is political philosophy, the way that kings argue, and the way the king's supporters and courtiers argue it ought to work. The way the kings ought to be seen as absolute rulers, should not be held accountable to anybody, should not have any limitations on their power. In practice, of course, to actually do whatever you want to do and not have any consequences for it turns out not to be so easy, right? And that's the other thing, is to be careful not to confuse the theory of royal absolutism with the practice of royal power. In reality, the kings still have a big uphill road to be able to exercise absolute power in their kingdoms. They still face rebellions. In France, you get a number of wars of religion, which are basically civil wars between Protestants and Catholics. The religion sort of determines the boundaries here, but in a sense, though, these wars also reflect the ability of people to raise rebellions and resist the power of the king. And the kings have, these are hard-fought wars. There's about 5 of them over the course of a century in France, hard-fought civil wars, which sort of underline the limitations on the king's power, right? People are, in fact, capable of raising armed resistance to the king, should they so wish. And you get other kinds of civil wars or rebellions and such, and struggles in other areas as well. The other thing is that although the nobles are gradually declining in power in some sense, or at least in order to maintain their power, are finding themselves needing to cooperate with kings more and more, nevertheless, they haven't instantly lost everything. This is a gradual thing where they're going from a very strong position and gradually getting forced to renegotiate that position, but they haven't had the entire rug pulled out from them instantaneously. Nobles are still very powerful, they still are very wealthy, they still have enormous influence, they still have enormous resources, and when an absolute monarch wants to get something done, he still has the residual power of the nobility to deal with in a big way. There's a couple of ways kings can go about dealing with the nobles in order to get things done. And when I say get things done, I mean get a law passed and enforced, or get taxes raised, or get military forces recruited and equipped and put in the field. These sort of practical business of government types of things. In order to get things done, the king sort of needs to figure out how to deal with the nobility. There are a couple of ways kings go about it. One, is to invent new nobles, kind of do an end run around the nobles, the existing hereditary landed nobility, by taking these sort of up-and-coming middle-class types, these wealthy merchants and bankers, and promoting them into the nobility, granting patents of nobility, sort of a document declaring a person noble and giving them a title. This becomes very popular. At first you're getting a few dozen, then hundreds, and then thousands of these patents of nobility being granted to commoners. And this does a couple of things for the kings. One, all of a sudden you can bring into court just a horde of new blood, new people with all these new noble titles going around. It kind of waters down the nobility and weakens the hereditary nobility a little bit. And then on the basis of their being noble, you can then move them into government positions and, grant them privileges and gifts and things like that. So sort of creating a new, more loyal group of people to water down the old, resistant hereditary nobility. The other thing with the patents of nobility is usually you don't give them away for free. Very often you sell them to wealthy merchants. And so it's also an extra resource the kings have to get extra revenues coming in. You can raise money by selling patents of nobility Nobles can't do that because they're not kings. Only kings can make somebody noble other than by heredity. So the kings sort of have an extra economic resource that the nobles don't have, and that's an advantage. So here's the one way of kind of doing an end run around the hereditary nobles and sort of watering down their power. The other thing, though, and probably more important in the long run, is you could co-opt the nobles, right? The king wants the nobles supporting him so that he can get taxes collected or soldiers recruited or whatever it is he needs. The nobles, on their hand, need extra leverage, extra privileges, extra resources in order to give them leverage against the uppity commoners who are sort of challenging them in their local power bases. And so the kings are very happy to cut a deal here where the nobles will get special privileges, maybe they'll get tax exemptions, maybe they'll get certain legal powers or legal exemptions or something like that commoners don't get. And they'll sort of, do this trade-off where the nobles will support the kings and encourage the king to, have absolute rule, and they'll support the king's agenda, and the kings, of their part, will reward them by granting them these sort of privileges and powers and local authority that will give the nobles leverage over against the commoners and allow them to sort of keep their heads above the water as the commoners are getting wealthier and more powerful. Okay, so absolutism here, number of things going on. They're sort of significant. When you look at the readings to discuss starting Thursday and through the weekend, take a particular look at Hobbes. You have a reading from Hobbes' book Leviathan, and that's sort of an interesting text for thinking about another way, what's going to become a very influential way, that Hobbes goes about trying to justify absolute royal authority. And hopefully we'll see if we can tell how that works. Okay, so anyway, very good, and I'm going to have one more video coming out to talk about science and the Enlightenment. Sorry, a lot of video lectures this week, but quite a bit of territory to cover. Thank you.